Hey, it's Mike. Let's talk about Reaper. I've recently been focusing on one of my favorite new features to Reaper 7, and that's fixed item lanes, or fixed media lanes, or fixed something or other. Whatever the proper name is, it's the new ability that gives us an alternative to traditional takes and comping in Reaper. Before I get too far into the video, I'd like to ask that if you're new to the channel, or if you're a longtime watcher but simply haven't subscribed yet, to kindly take a moment of your time and click that subscribe button. Your liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing the videos helps greatly to feed the YouTube algorithm and allow the channel to reach new viewers. In looking at YouTube stats, currently a little over 60% of my viewers are not subscribers. It's free, only takes a moment of your time, and it'll help me greatly, so go ahead and click that subscribe button. Now go ahead, I'll wait. Now that we've got that out of the way, I've been speaking with some of the community members, and it seems that there's a bit of interest in using the fixed item lanes method for recording multi-mic instruments. This could be really handy in my case for drum tracking and editing, and I would be doing myself a disservice if I didn't mention my drum editing and Reaper course on ProMix Academy. There's a link in the description if that's something you'd like to check out, but it could also be used for guitar miking, if you like to capture a DI, cabinet, and room mics at the same time, or if you like to track acoustic guitar, which is commonly done with a couple of mics directly on the guitar, and possibly a few more to capture room sound. Whatever multi-mic scenario you may be working with, today's tutorial is focused on setting up for multi-mic recordings using fixed item lanes and subsequently editing those recordings. I'll need to track some drums to give you a bit of a real-world example for this, but before I start tracking, let's take a look how I've got Reaper set up. For this project, I've recorded a little bit of guitar and bass just to give myself something to play along with, and I've already got my drum tracking template up and running here in Reaper. You may notice these red flags or markers that are on my drum tracks. I've got my drum tracks grouped so that when I get to the editing phase, I'll be editing all of my drum tracks at the same time. If I highlight my kick track, and then go down and shift-click my room ride track, so that all of my drum tracks with the exception of the top level folder are selected, I'll press Shift-G to bring up my grouping dialog, and I can see in the dialog that I've got each of these tracks added to the group for Media, Razor Edit Lead, and Media, Razor Edit Follow. Again, what this means is that when I get to the editing phase, any media item or razor edit that I perform on any media item on these selected tracks will automatically be performed across all of the tracks. It's very important when you're working with multi-mic'd instruments that your edits occur across all of the tracks. Another grouping option that I like to add to these tracks, especially for drum editing where I've got 12 different microphones, is Record Arm Lead and Record Arm Follow. What this means is I can click the record button on any of the tracks in this group, and all of the tracks will be armed or disarmed accordingly. I'll close out of my group, and then focus on track number 6, which is my drum's top level folder. I'll press Shift-G to enter into the group for that, and you can see that my folder track is also a member of that same group, but I do not have it selected for Media, Razor Edit, Lead, or Follow. This is because my top level track is not recording anything, and I found that if I had that added into the same grouping portion, it would cause a few glitches with the fixed item lanes. I've got a video on my drum tracking template, but I have made a few changes since that video. One other thing to note about my drum tracking template, I have recording disabled for this track. So if I click on this and go to Input Mono, you can see that this is still tied to one of my inputs. However, if I move directly to the input option here, I have Record, Disable, Input Monitoring Only. This is also useful if I'm live streaming while playing drums. In this way, I can turn on input monitoring for each of the selected tracks, and even though nothing will be recorded directly on the drums folder, it will still output sound. There's a few more things that I'd like to set up before I go back to the kit to record some drums. I'd like to set up a click track and a headphone monitoring track where I can adjust the mix to hear what I need to hear, without affecting whatever mix I may already have in the main session. To create my click track, I'll double-click below my drums to add a new track. I'll call it Click. And I'm going to right-click my metronome and make sure that I've got my volumes set the way that I'd like, and also my beat pattern set the way that I'd like, and this is fine for this project. Now I'll make a time selection, and you can see that I've already got a time selection, but I'd like to get the two measures ahead of time. I do like to have a pre-roll before going into the section that I'd like to record, but I want to make sure that my metronome is also playing during that pre-roll period. So with snapping enabled, I'll grab from the end of this time selection and go back to the beginning of the track. I'll zoom in just a bit and make sure that my time selection is correct, and I am indeed at the end of that portion. So now I'll go back to the beginning of the song, and with my click track selected, go to Insert, and click Source. If I bring my project back into full view, we can see that I've got a click track listed here. Now I'll need to make my headphone monitoring track. If you'd like a more detailed video on setting up a headphone monitoring mix that also includes the ability to control your own in-ear mix with your cell phone, click the link above. I'll highlight my guitars track, and this is a folder that contains my left and right guitar and lead guitar, and I'll also control click the bass, and Control-click the click track, that is a mouthful, and I have a button in my top toolbar to create my monitor mixes. So I'll click my monitor mix button, and you can see that by default mine is already set with the bus name of drum monitor, and I'm sending to output 7 on my audio interface. I'm also not sending this track to the master, and everything that's being sent to this bus is being sent pre-fader. The pre-fader portion means that any changes that I make to inputs on this track will not affect my main session. So I'll create that Q bus, and I'd like for my click track to be more prominent than the guitars and the bass just to help ensure that I stay on time as best I can. So I'll turn down the guitars and bass by a little bit. That's probably a bit too much, but I can adjust it from my cell phone once I get behind the kit. And I can close out of these two dialogues. Now I also want to make sure that while I'm recording this tutorial that the click track is not captured on the video. So I'll go back to my click track and click on the routing button and uncheck the master send. I'm still sending to track 20, which is my drum monitor, but I want to make sure that this click track does not bleed back over into the master track for you to hear. Now that I've got this set the way I like, I can close this dialogue and get behind the kit and record some drums. We'll see you back here in a few. Alright, we've got our drums recorded, so let's take a look at Reaper and see how we can work with these newly recorded tracks in fixed item lanes. Let's take a look. I've currently got my drum tracks collapsed. To give us a bit more room to work with, I'll get the mixer out of the way. And let's expand the snare top track. I can see from my snare top track that I did 6 passes, and if I open up my snare bottom track, for example, I should see the same thing reflected. So I've got 6 takes across all 12 of my mics, neatly organized in fixed item lanes. Typically when I'm drum editing, the first thing that I like to do is line up my first transient. And while this isn't a full-on drum editing tutorial, I do want to get my first one lined up on the first pass, just to make sure that things line up a bit better. So let's take a look at track number 7, which is my kick track, and I'll expand that. And before I start to work on that track, I'd also like to expand one of my other tracks so you can see it at the same time. If I highlight the media item in fixed item lane 1, we can see that that same item is highlighted across all of my other tracks. This is because of the grouping that we did earlier in the tutorial. The same is true if I switch to item 2, 3, 4, and so on. So going back to item 1, and making sure that my snapping is turned off, which it is, I'd like to expand this to the left a little bit, and then I'd like to focus in a bit closer to make sure that my first kick is on grid. There's a button to the upper left of the item lane headers, and I can click this to cycle through a few different view options. I'll click this once to make the tracks big, I can click it again to make the lane small, or I can shift click it to just show one lane, and that's what I'd like for right now. So I'll zoom in a bit, and I can see that my kick looks to be a few milliseconds off, so I'll hold Alt and left click and drag to slip that into place, and you can see that my other items are following suit. So with that grouping enabled, if I make cuts, slip edits, or any type of media item edit, it'll be performed across all of my tracks. So now with that first transient on grid, I can go ahead and switch back to my other mode. Let's take a quick listen to the first pass. So getting that first kick transient in place helps to ensure that if I loop the track, that it comes back right on time. I could definitely hear a few spots that were off by maybe a few milliseconds, and I can fix those a bit later, but for right now I'd just like to take a look at how to comp with my fixed item lanes. But then again, I've already got a video on comping with fixed item lanes, so click the link above if you'd like a bit more detail on that. There's a few things that I'm finding about fixed item lanes that differs a bit from how the same operation would happen with traditional takes. For example, with traditional takes, if I press the T key, I would switch to the next take, and Shift T would take me to the previous take. Takes and fixed item lanes can coexist in the same track in Reaper 7, and because of that, a little bit of a difference in operation is necessary. I found a few actions that help make this a little bit easier for me. So let's take a look at Actions, and Action List, and let's search for Next, if I can spell it, Next Lane. And there's an action, Track Lanes, Play Only Next Lane. And I've assigned the key press Alt-T to this. That way I can still use T for going to the next take if I'm using traditional takes, or I can use Alt-T to go to the next lane if I'm working with fixed media items, or fixed item lanes. I'll get that right eventually. With that key press assigned, I'd like to also look for Previous Lane. And the action is Track Lanes, Play Only Previous Lane, and I have that bound to Alt-Shift-T. So I'll close out of my actions list, and if I'd like to listen to or preview the next track, I can press Alt-T, and that changes me to my second lane across all grouped items. I'd like to do the same thing for this and zoom in a bit, and just make sure that my first transient is on point, and it looks to be pretty close. I'll press Alt-T to move to my next one, and we'll check that as well. And I was off a bit there, so I'll slip edit that into place, and continue to go down the line and do the same thing for each of the tracks. Most of these are looking pretty good, they're just off by a few milliseconds. And once again, these actions are performed across all the tracks. Now I've got lane 6 selected, and I can play back this lane and use those key presses to switch lanes at any time, or I can click the header to switch lanes. So you can use those key presses or click on the lane headers to help you decide which part that you'd like to use for your comp. But I think for the time being, I'd like to just leave everything as it is now, and maybe we can do a live stream in the near future to perform a comp and drum edit for this piece. Fixed item lanes definitely gives you a bit more flexibility than you had with the traditional takes in Reaper. However, you've also got the option of mixing traditional takes and fixed item lanes in the same session. We'll take a look at that in a later episode. I hope this helps. If you like the content you're seeing, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And you can support the channel further by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee, I like coffee, Super Thanks, or Patreon links below. Visit us on Discord and engage with other Reaper users. We'll see you next time. This coffee's pretty good, but I think I may need a cough drop too. This cough's getting terrible. Hair in my mouth.